Record 3. Jacket, wall, the table. I've looked over what I wrote yesterday, and I see it wasn't as clear as it should be. It's perfectly clear for any of us, but who knows? Maybe you unknown people who'll get my notes when the integral brings them. Maybe you've read the great book of civilization only up to the page our ancestors reached about 900 years ago. Maybe you don't even know the basics, like the table of hours. Personal hours, maternal norm, green wall, benefactor. It feels funny to me, and at the same time it's very hard to talk about all this. It's just as if a writer of the 20th century, for instance, had to explain in his novel what he meant by jacket, or apartment, or wife. Still, if his novel was translated for savages, there is no way he could write jacket without putting in a note. Jesus. I'm sure a savage would look at jacket and think, what's that for? Something else, just something else to carry. I think you'll probably look at me the same way when I tell you that not one of us, ever since the 200 Years' War, has ever been on the other side of the green wall. But my dear readers, you'll have to do just a little thinking. It helps a lot. Because you know all human history, as far back as we know it, is the history of moving from nomadic life to a more settled way of life. So doesn't it follow that the most settled form of life, ours, is by the same token the most perfect form of life, ours? If people used to wander over the earth from one end to the other, that only happened in prehistoric times, when there were nations and wars and trade and discoveries of this and that America. But why do it now? Who needs it? I'll admit that people did not take to this settled way of life right away and without any trouble. When the 200 Years' War destroyed all the roads and the grass covered them over, during that first time it probably seemed very uncomfortable living in cities that were cut off from one another by all the tangled green stuff. But what of that? After man's tail fell off, it was probably some little while before he learned to shoo away the flies without a tail. I don't doubt that during that first time he probably missed his tail. But now, can you even imagine yourself with a tail? Or can you imagine yourself walking down the street naked without your jacket? Maybe you still run around in jackets. Well, it's the same here. I can't imagine a city that isn't girdled about with a green wall. I can't imagine a life that isn't clad in the numerical robes of the table. The table, at this very minute, from the wall of my room, its purple fingers on their golden ground, are looking down at me sternly and tenderly, straight in the eyes. I can't help thinking of what the ancients called an icon, and I feel like composing a poem or a prayer, which is the same thing. Oh, why am I not a poet, so that I might celebrate you properly, O table, O heart and pulse of one state? All of us as school children, and you too perhaps, used to read that the greatest of all moments of ancient literature that has come down to us, the railroad timetable. But set even next to the table, and what you'll see is graphite and diamond. But set even this next to the table, and what you'll see is graphite and diamond. They're both one and the same element, C, carbon. But how eternal, transparent, and brilliant is the diamond? Who doesn't catch his breath when he ruffles through the pages of the railroad timetable? But the table of hours, it turns each one of us right there in broad daylight into a steel, six-wheeled epic hero. Every morning with six-wheeled precision, and at the very same hour, and at the very same minute, we get up, millions of us, as though we were one. At the very same hour, millions of us as one At the very same hour, millions of us as one, we start work. Later, millions as one, we stop. And then, like one body with a million hands, at one and the same second, according to the table, we lift the spoon to our lips. And at one and the same second, we leave for a stroll and go to the auditorium, to the hall for the tailor exercises, and then to bed. I'll be completely honest with you. Even we haven't yet solved the problem of happiness with 100% accuracy. Twice a day, from 1600 to 1700, and again from 2100 to 2200, the single mighty organism breaks down into its individual cells. These are the personal hours, as established by the table. During these hours, you'll see that some are in their rooms with the blinds modestly lowered. Others are walking along the avenue in step with the brass beat of the march. Still others, like me at this moment, will be at their desks. But I firmly believe, let them call me an idealist and dreamer, but I firmly believe, sooner or later, one day, we'll find a place for even these hours in the general formula. One day, all 86,400 seconds will be on the table of hours. I've read and heard a lot of unbelievable stuff about those times when people lived in freedom, that is, disorganized wildness. But of all things, the very hardest for me to believe was how the governmental power of that time, even if it was still embryonic, could have permitted people to live without even a semblance of our table, without obligatory walks, without precisely established meal times, getting up and going to bed whenever it pleased them. Some historians even claim that in those days, lights burned on the street all night. People were out walking, driving on the streets all night long. Now that's something I simply cannot get through my head. No matter how limited their powers of reason might have been, they still must have understood that living like this was just murder, a capital crime, except it was slow, day-by-day murder. The government, or humanity, would not permit capital punishment for one man, but they permitted the murder of millions a little at a time. To kill one man, that is, to subtract 50 years from the sum of all human lives, that was a crime. But to subtract from the sum of all human lives 50 million years, that was not. To kill one man, that is, to subtract 50 years from the sum of all human lives, that was a crime. But to subtract from the sum of all human lives 50 million years, that was not a crime. No, really, isn't that funny? This problem in moral math could be solved in half a minute by any 10-year-old number today, but they couldn't solve it. All their cants together couldn't solve it, because it never occurred to one of their cants to construct a system of scientific ethics, that is, one based on subtraction, addition, division, and multiplication. And then, isn't it absurd that a government, it had the nerve to call itself a government, could let sexual life proceed without the slightest control? Who, when, however much you wanted, completely unscientific, like animals. And blindly, like animals, they produced young. Isn't it funny to know horticulture, poultry keeping, fish farming, we have very precise records of their knowing all of this, and not to be able to reach the last rung of this logical ladder, child production? Not to come up with something like our maternal and paternal norms? It's so funny, so improbable that now that I've written it, I'm afraid that you, my unknown readers, will think I'm making wicked jokes. You might suddenly think I'm making fun of you and keeping a straight face while I tell you the most absolute nonsense. But in the first place, I simply can't make jokes. The default value of every joke is a lie. And in the second place, one state science declares that ancient life was exactly as I have described it. And one state science cannot make a mistake. Besides, where could any governmental logic have come from anyway when people lived in the condition known as freedom? That is, like beasts, monkeys, cattle. What could you have expected from them, if even in our day you can still very occasionally hear coming up from the bottom, from the hairy depths, a wild, ape-like echo? Only now and again, fortunately. These are, fortunately, no more than little chance details. It's easier to repair them without bringing to a halt the great eternal progress of the whole machine. And in order to discard some bolt that has gotten bent, we have the heavy and skillful hand of the benefactor. We have the experienced eye of the guardians. Which, now that I think of it, reminds me that number yesterday, with the double bend like an S, I think I saw him once coming out of the Bureau of Gardens. Now I see why I had that instinctive feeling of respect for him, and why I felt so awkward when that strange I-330 in his presence. I must confess that I-330. That's the bell for sleep. It's 22:30. See you tomorrow.